the intentional body stances or body moves, the foundational body moves I call them, that you'll be able to use to amplify your captivation. So let's first talk let's first talk about the mistakes. When people don't intentionally use their bodies tell stories, and sometimes those stories are, I'm really afraid to be here right now. I don't want to be here right now. I want to be anywhere else but here right now. And that gets transferred to the audience. It creates the suspicion, some of the things that I just mentioned. So I want you to avoid at all costs these 6 mistakes. And we have images on the right side of the paper here on page 3 that you can use to remind yourself of what these mistakes are. So the first one is the stick in the mud. And I've already alluded to it several times. You don't want to be that person who has their feet planted, like cemented to the floor, and their arms are not moving, are not doing anything, because it's creepy. It's creepy when you're not moving and people start going like, what's the deal here? Now, if that's intentional, that's fine. Every movement that I'm saying is a mistake is totally fine to use if it's intentional. So there are no rules to speaking. There are laws that I want you to understand, right? But there are no rules. There are no rules that say you can't say you can't say ah. If that's intentional, if that's part of your story, if you're doing it to create some kind of feeling in the audience, then absolutely do it. Most people will say don't put your hands in your pocket, or don't go forward or backward, right? If you study speaking from, certain people or certain organizations, they'll teach you what moves that you should do, what moves you shouldn't do, what things you should do, what things you should say and never say. I call BS on every rule in speaking, because sometimes you want to do that intentionally if you're more committed to the experience of the audience than the rules of public speaking, right? So, this first one, stick in the mud, unless it's intentional, move your body, do something that allows people to be more engaged with you, right? The second one I call the caged lion. And that's when people are just moving back and forth like they're a lion in a cage, right? And I know that we're taught that we should move around, but when all you're doing is going from point A to point B, and then you're looking at the crowd, it really kind of feels like you're a lion that's about ready to pounce, right? And that can create fear in the audience. It really can. It can create a sense of anxiety in the audience, because it's very aggressive if you're using that movement and they get triggered, or they're just like, why is this happening? It creates some suspicion if there's just constant movement like that, right? The third one is a version of the cage lion, but it's a toned down version of the cage lion. And that's when you just wander all over but never actually come to a stop. I love watching speakers' unconscious tendencies. I remember I was watching a speaker one time, and I told somebody to the side, I go, watch this. The speaker goes over here and does this little shift, 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 and then comes back. And she would go over here, shift to her hip, shift to her hip, shift to her hip, and then come back. And she was just wandering around like this the whole time. And it's not the caged lion, but it's just lazy movement. And the wanderer sometimes can actually have a hypnotic effect on your audience, which you don't want, again, unless it's intentional, unless you're trying to hypnotize them. You don't want the hypnotic effect, because then they start to tune out what you're doing or what you're saying or what you're trying to share with them a lot of times, because they're just literally in this trance, right? And that causes the opposite of captivation. Sometimes it'll cause people to actually fall asleep on you, right? So you don't want to just wander around with no purpose. Here's the basic rule, even though I said don't think about rules. If there was a rule, the rule would be to move with intention. I don't want you to be a stick in the mud. I don't want you to be a caged lion, but I don't want you to be a wanderer. So what do I want you to do? I want you to move intentionally. If you want to come over here, then move to this spot, but then stay here. Then if you want to move over here and address this audience, but then stop. And maybe move around and stay here, but then come over here. Like, do everything with intention. Don't just allow yourself to get caught up in these unconscious rhythms that don't support you, right? There's no purpose to them. The fourth one, this is a funny one that I've seen so many people do. I just call it fingertip fighting. When people just have their fingertips, going after each other, basically, and all they do, the scope of their movement, the extent of their movement is to just bring the fingertips out a couple inches apart from each other and then put them back together again. It's so distracting when people are just fighting with their fingertips. Sometimes they're doing other things with their fingertips. Sometimes they'll just hold them together. But whenever you do something like this, it's restrictive. It causes your elbows to lock. It really doesn't show any kind of animation. It doesn't show any sort of normal movements. But a lot of people get locked up, and I don't know what this is. I don't know, what the origin is, why people do this, but it's very distracting, and it's not helpful for you to be more. Oh, she's a fingertip fighter. Okay, I won't mention the name, but if you're listening to or if you're seeing the chat, somebody just identified somebody as a fingertip fighter. So I don't want you to be a fingertip fighter. I also don't want you to be a fingertip fumbler. Right? None of that stuff is helpful. Again, unless it's intentional. Maybe you're telling a story about somebody, but usually that's going to restrict you, right? The fifth one, I call the C-3po Elbows, right? C-3po walks around and his elbows never really move. I mean, his arms kind of go up and down, but his elbows never move. And a lot of speakers do that too. They're so afraid of being open with their body language, and they might move around a little bit, but then they look like a robot. And that's also kind of creepy to people, right? Let your arms loose sometimes. Move your joints all the way around. Don't get locked in any of these unconscious patterns. And then the sixth one is kind of an all-encompassing one, and I just call it peculiar patterns. These could be verbal patterns. If somebody says all the time, or one of the patterns that I created when I was a speaker early on is I would check in with people and I would say, does that make sense? Like all the time. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Does that make sense? That becomes a peculiar verbal pattern. Like is another word that in today's society is used all the time. But if you're always saying my wife is like, hey, do you want some muffins? And I'm like, I don't want muffins. I'd rather have some donuts. And she's like, okay, I'll go get some donuts. Little things like that, even if they're hip in the culture, they can become distracting if they show up too much. Or sometimes your patterns are more physical, right? So if you do weird things, if you got some kind of tic, or you always go to your nose, or you keep doing things with your ear, usually those patterns are unconscious. They're like protective mechanisms that we've developed, but you've got to be aware of them, because if you're always going to your ear when you're talking about things, pretty soon the audience is going to go, why are they always going to their ear, right? It's like it's going to create sirens going off in their head, and they're going to want to try to figure out what's going on here. It's going to be suspicious a lot of times. And then what might happen, you've probably been an audience member of somebody, whether it's in a classroom with a substitute teacher or a regular teacher, or watching somebody give a seminar or whatever. What happens is, if somebody has a peculiar pattern, you start focusing on the pattern, and a lot of times you'll start counting, how often they do it. Okay, how many seconds is it going to be before they go to their ear again? Or how many times? Okay, that's 3, that's 4, that's 5. Any kind of peculiar patterns that aren't serving you and they're not done intentional can be distracting to the audience, right? So those are the mistakes that I want you to be aware of. And it all falls under intentionality, right? If something is not intentional, then do whatever you can to get rid of it, right? So those are the mistakes. Let's get into the last piece here. Let's get into the 7 foundational moves that you can use to amplify your captivation. Now again, I learned these and I focused on them and studied them and would use these from a performance standpoint when I was in a speaking contest. But they're all captivating in nature, so it doesn't have to be a performance situation where they're appropriate, because they work all the time if you use them correctly, right? And what they'll also do is they'll give you something in your body to pay attention to. They'll give you some intentionality, and they'll give you ways to create some of those highlights that I was talking about. So what I'm going to give you are 7 different moves or stances that you can put into your communication, especially your stories, to amplify the way it captivates the audience and the way that it lands.